Contention 1 is protectionism. Trade liberalization, embodied in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, relies solely on the good faith commitment of the international community to reduce those subsidies. The affirmative position, which they identify as support for the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity, goes in the opposite direction. It creates ever-expanding groups of economic sectors that will not be considered in trade negotiations. It is this kind of bad faith that has kept the Doha stalled for over a decade. The reduction of trade barriers is a reciprocal process. The US has subsidies for agriculture, China has subsidies for solar panels, and so on and so on. The problem is that approaches like the affirmative and the UNESCO Convention in particular signal a troubling lack of commitment to trade liberalization as they establish an all-or-nothing approach to the gradual de-escalation of national support for industries. Pierre Schwab of Harvard and Karsten Steinfort of the Organization of American States explained that creating ambiguous exceptions for cultural expression risks being used as a guise for protectionism. They write that states should codify an explicit hierarchy of least burdensome means of supporting domestic cultural industries. Because of its fluid nature, a concept like cultural diversity could easily become the favorite veil used to disguise protective measures, requiring the international trading system to indulge protectionist policies. So while Saab and Steinfort supported the principle of cultural diversity, they make it clear that explicit codification of reciprocal and effective support for culture is necessary to stop the quick slide into protectionism. Unfortunately, neither the convention nor the position of the affirmative achieves this difficult but important balancing act. The UNESCO's convention's exclusion of entire industries is a massive blow against the promise of progressive trade liberalization, e.g. the shared commitment of the WTO members to put all their protectionist policies on the table and hope of an eventual elimination. The trade regime relies on mutual trust that every other nation is committed to the elimination of trade barriers. Otherwise, the difficult and tedious process of negotiation is not worth it. Contention 2 is cultural annihilation. The affirmative support for culture has not been delicate, but rather sweeping, ill-conceived, and heavy-handed. The affirmative tells us what's bad, but tells us very little about what's good. National governments have many domestic lobbying interests that incentivize and demand these sweeping support mechanisms. If we let each country's domestic lobbyists determine what kind of economic measures were best, there would be an endless rush to subsidize any and all commercial ventures. In fact, this economic system has been tried. It's called mercantilism. The problem with the affirmative position is that there's no way to differentiate between what's good or bad cultural support policies. They focus too heavily on defining out culture like pop culture while leaving out a standard that can determine what constitutes good cultural support measure. Professor Crawford Smith explains, the convention, covering a whole gamut of often controversial support measures, makes no reference to principles such as proportionality or effectiveness, which could guide the application of these measures and serve to prevent more blatant forms of protectionism. What's more, the ambiguity of the very idea of cultural support makes it indefinitely malleable and open to abuse. The affirmative's argument is persuasive at first glance, but upon deeper inspection, the principles of cultural expression and protection embodied in the UNESCO Convention are so vague that they can be easily manipulated to support protectionism and do nothing to support minority cultures in the developing world that are actually at risk. Remember, our focus on UNESCO policy is key in defining what role the affirmative and negative play when it comes to the resolution. The affirmative cannot provide you with a good solution to the problems that they present if they fail to define what good constitutes in the first place. Contention 3 is token diversity. The affirmative argues that culture somehow ceases to exist in a free market. This is an obvious red herring. Developed countries such as France and Canada promoted the treaty to support their political motivations in trade negotiations. The appeal to minority cultural rights coming from France has banned the wearing of a hijab, and other European nations seems at best hypocritical and at worst deceptively self-serving. In each case, the government gets to pick the culture that are supported. This won't be the truly diverse cultures of minority people in France, but rather the culture of white francophone elitists. The only way to move away from this is to focus on culture as being something that can be understood in the terms of the market, in terms of the economic market. A free market solves. The convention does nothing to support indigenous cultures. The affirmative's offhand suggestion that their position protects minority indigenous culture is indicative of the token gesture made by Eurocentric nations that wrote and pushed for cultural exception. Crawford writes that for developing countries or minority groups in the convention offers nothing by way of concrete entitlement. Given that cultural diversity may be threatened as much, if not more, by forces operating internally within states, the underlying preoccupation of the convention with interstate relations and international trade represent a clear limitation. In fact, the convention has no way to mediate between different cultures, within states or between them. This means that majority culture can justify government policies that are discriminatory or even against foreign cultures, and people without any means of recourse by those that are excluded. This leads to the diametric opposite of what the affirmative aims to achieve. It does not seem beyond imagination that xenophobic or racist trade policies can be justified on the basis of natural culture. In fact, ignoring the important role of property rights in advancing indigenous culture is itself a Western construct. Culture is property in many non-Western ways. Only we view culture as necessarily individually owned or copywritten. This Western-oriented way of fashioning culture as something that one owns by a trademark or copyright is more problematic than beneficial, as it only speaks to a small section of what constitutes culture and how it's being utilized in our world today. The idea of communal property is a paradigm that demonstrates the possibilities of viewing culture commercially, valuing it for its contribution to the society as a whole. Coombe, professor of law at York University, argues, we understand the very concept of property if we focus primarily upon a Western model of exclusive individual or corporate ownership, as many critics do. Critics of cultural property wrongly conflate it with narrow and fundamental paradigm of property that emphasizes alienation, exclusivity, and commodification. It would seem prudent, however, to avoid fetishizing a particular concept of property simply in order to counter certain fetishizations of culture. Property plays many important roles in society. It makes itself manifest in ideologies, multiple legal systems, social relations, social practices, and interrelations between these. The very topic of cultural property. In other words, cultural property is not something that only maintains an individual and has an individual ownership, but also is something that transcends outside of that ownership that is shared by that particular individual, but something that can be shared by a society, and that can be propagated through the market in a cultural realm that is looking at it from a free market approach, as opposed to not prioritizing a free market approach. In other words, looking at it in a way that can be controlled and manipulated by the state. Thus, we urge you to reject the resolution and the idea that countries should have a free pass to take protectionist and xenophobic actions in the name of cultural diversity. Thank you.